kid. They reminded me in 2006 what I used to be like when I was a kid, and we used to be driving around, and apparently I used to point out to things and say, oh, that could be done better, you know, or they didn't do a very good job on that, you know. Oh, they should have done that better, you know. So eventually I became an engineer and wanted to do that stuff and do it better, you know. And when I was, you know, first started work, and I had to work in the middle of the city, and I was living in the outer suburbs, and the motorway at that time only had 2 lanes, and it used to take sometimes 45 minutes just to go about 3 miles because all of this traffic was merging onto 2 lanes. And then when I went to the technical college at night school to learn my, you know, get my qualifications, I came across a book in the library that showed how in the 1920s it started, but in the 1970s there was very advanced plans for an electric rapid rail system for Auckland. And, you know, it said that the estimated time to get from where I lived, where the nearest station would be, to where I worked, would be 12 minutes. You know, and I was I was taking an hour and a half every day, backwards and forwards, just to get to work, with everybody else getting to work at the same time, and it's just crazy. And and they actually started building about 2 meters of that rapid rail system. They started boring the tunnel under the city, and then they stopped because the central government said, well, we're not going to pay for it, and the regional government said, well, we haven't got the money to pay for it. So it didn't happen, and it's been put off, and they've still got the plans there, and it's still not happening because, it's too expensive, you know. And it would have completely changed the lives of all the people that live in that city. It would have made, I mean, Auckland is a beautiful place anyway, but it would have made it so much better, you know, to not have that traffic problem, all that stress, all of that pollution going out of the tailpipes. You know, we limit ourselves so much, and that's what really drives me crazy as an engineer. But then also more than that, what drives me crazy is the injustice, you know, and then, you know, that's a moral issue like Bob Petita's talked about, and that gets me angry as well. But my first thing was that I didn't want to be limited, you know. I just don't like being constrained or restrained unnecessarily. Obviously there are natural limitations, but there should never be monetary limitations. So here we have what the American Monetary Institute calls the science of money. And Stephen has talked about this, and I think that this is one of the most advanced conceptions, and it came from Aristotle, and I don't know much about Aristotle myself, but I think that he was right on the money on this one, if you excuse the pun. So just read through that, and you basically will get where we're coming from. Okay, yeah, well, that's a good idea. I think it certainly deserves being read aloud, even in my funny accent. All right, so all goods must therefore be measured by some one thing. Now this unit is in truth demand. Money has become by convention a sort of representative of demand, and exists not by nature but by law. Money then acting as a measure makes goods commensurate and equates them. Okay, so the interpretation that I take from that anyway is that what we can supply, we can demand by law. And you know, the monetary reformers motto, James Gibbs Stewart gave me a nice laminated certificate with the monetary reformers motto on it, and it basically goes, whatever is physically possible and socially desirable must be financially possible. And you know, other people here in this room have repeated pretty much the same thing, and that's one of the credos of monetary reform, you know, and it's pretty, and when you think about it, it should be pretty obvious because it's just numbers, you know, and why should we be limited by numbers? So going on from that, basically you have to, it's not brain surgery. It's a pretty simple thing when you sort of snap onto it. But it's not brain surgery. But I'm going to try and perform a couple of lobotomies on you today. And the first one is to go dunk and separate out what's real and what's financial. Okay, so real is like wealth, like it's like the raw materials, the machinery, the equipment that we use to make products, and then it's the products, and it's all of the infrastructure that goes to support that, like the electricity and the roads and the water and the sewage and all of that, and the fields growing the corn, and people growing the corn, and people building houses and doing all that stuff, and that's real wealth. And wealth is basically another word for well-being. And then we've got the financial, and if you wanted to put it on the real, we must give top priority to what's real, and then what's financial is a subsidiary of that. And if you wanted to put it in a balance sheet form, you'd have the real on the assets side, and it shouldn't be a liability. It should be a financial reflection of a positive, and only a positive, because there's no negative wealth. That's like, is there a negative Roosevelt University somewhere? I don't think so. So nothing in reality is created with any debt. So its financial equivalent shouldn't be created with any debt either. It's pretty basic. Okay, so now we have a quote from Stephen Zarlenga. This is the culmination of his 12 years of research and looking at all of the great monetary ideas and all of the history, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the monetary applications or considerations of that. And so money's essence, apart from whatever is used to signify it, is an abstract social power embodied in law as an unconditional means of payment. Okay, so you note that it's societal, and so it belongs to all of us. Okay, our monetary system is like a financial reflection of everything that we've got, and we've already got it. It's here. We're right here now in Roosevelt University, bricks and mortar, people, thinking, electricity, computers, it's all here. And there's no debt in any of that, in reality. Okay, so what's the problem? Too much debt, not enough money. 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 We could chant that outside the Federal Reserve or outside Capitol or White House or whatever, And there we have, that's the 2008 statistics, and obviously the debt's gone up since then, and you see various figures. Some people say 53, some people say 57. It depends which things you count and don't count. I don't count the what they call the intragovernmental debt, which is basically the trust funds that were raided and debt obligations that the Fed or the federal government owes to itself or to its own programs, which is silly. And the total money figure that I use there is what's called MZM, and that comes out of the St. Louis Fed, and it's basically money at zero maturity, which is basically the money that is supposedly people can get hold of without having to wait for it, but I don't know if they could actually do that. So what's the solution then? Always have enough money. How? Create money without debt. Create money as needed to match the value of things in life. In this way, our quality of life cannot be artificially limited by any lack of money, and it never should be. It never should be. And it really is that simple. So what's in the US Constitution? You know, we talk about restoring constitutional monetary power, and it says the Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. So you note that there's a distinction between the coin with a lowercase and the coin with an uppercase, and last year at Harvard University, scholar worked out that the coin with a lowercase means to create money, just create money in general, and the coin with an uppercase refers to like actual coinage. And at the time, with a reference to foreign coiners, because at the time, you know, when the US was still getting founded, there was various types of coinage sort of being circulated. So, you know, when they were setting up a new country, you want to sort of have some way of saying, oh, so many of this is worth so much of that. And you know, interestingly there, you've got your weights and measures included in the same clause. And I talked about measurement science, what I worked at when I first left school. And, you know, nobody, you know, the National Institute of whatever it is, which has got the Bureau of Weights and Measures, you know, nobody's jumping up and down or worried that the government's making the yard longer or shorter, or the government's making the pound lighter or heavier, you know. It's just a function, it's just a statutory function that's been assigned to a body to do it, you know. And they do it, they can measure it very accurately, you know, to like a fraction of a light wave, and they have reference standards, and I used to do all of this stuff, you know. One of my jobs was to be in charge of the calibration of all of the equipment, and so we would have reference materials that we would use, and reference standards and bars and whatever lengths, whatever physical parameter you wanted to measure, we had a reference for it, and then that reference was taken to a calibration laboratory, and then the reference that they use is taken to another one, and it builds up, and it all ends up in France, you know, with the ISO system, you know. And this is all, you know, pretty basic stuff. I mean, it's complicated and technical, but it's not difficult, you know. Okay, so what's the solution again? Always have enough money, create money without debt, create money as needed to match the value of things in life, and in this way our quality of life cannot be artificially limited by any lack of money. Okay, so the American Monetary Act has got 3 interrelated elements which must all be done together. And I'm going to be repeating this a little bit, but I'm going to try and keep it exciting as well. Okay, so we put the Fed into the Treasury, like the US Mint already is, you know, it's a bureau within the Treasury, and then you've got the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which is also in the Treasury, and they actually do the printing of the currency, you know, the paper money, or I think it's made out of cotton these days. But yeah, and then, you know, so we take back our sovereign power. And we, you know, for we the people, it's democracy, you know, it's democratizing the monetary system. And it should be part of it's a social thing, you know, it's a social thing. And the founding fathers knew that, and monetary reformers know that, and some good economists know that as well. And again, we're fortunate to have some here with us. Okay, so why all 3 elements have to be done, and basically we learn from the experience of history, we learn the lessons and the mistakes, and I'll give some very brief things here. But basically we know that if we do any 1 or any 2 steps, it won't work in the long term, because 1 or 2 steps have been tried in various places at various times, and all of those places are right back in the same situation that we're at now, here and now, you know. 98% of the money supply is created as debt. So if we only nationalise the Federal Reserve, nothing would really change, you know. The central banks in Canada, New Zealand and the UK, they've all been nationalised in the 1930s and 1940s, and in each country today, 97-98% of the money supply is created by the commercial banking system. It's not created by the central bank, and which could create the money without a debt if it wanted to, which they usually only do for wars or for bailing out banks. If we did step element 2, there would be a shortage of money pretty soon, like in the 1830s when they tried to restrict the banks of creating money, and the Treasury didn't fill the gap that was created, and there was a severe depression, and so it caused all sorts of ramifications, and basically then the banks said, well, we have to take us over again because it's terrible. It's ridiculous to have not enough money. But at that time they had a misconception about money. They thought that it had to be gold and silver and stuff like that. So, and so as society progresses, the economy must be enabled to progress along with it. So new money is always needed. If we only did element 3 while keeping the present banking practices in place, there would only be minimal and temporary change. Like the US Treasury has been issuing money for a long time, the coins since the beginning, and then at various times from about 1812 to 1971, that's 160 years, there's been various issues and reissues of Treasury money, but the proportion has become less and less significant. So now it's just it's nothing. So if you allow if they allow the banking system to keep any part of it, they'll just work their way back to getting all of it back again, or pretty much all of it. And we know that because every country has 97-98% of money created that way. So, but when the sovereign power, if we try to share between public and private entities, there's obviously going to be conflicts of interest there, and it's just inevitable that there's going to be ructions and friction and all sorts of carry on, which is unnecessary. So if we only did element 1 and 2, there wouldn't really be much of the benefits that people would notice and get excited about. So what happened in New Zealand, they did do elements 1 and 2, and they did elements 1 and 3, that's the next one. But there wouldn't be much for people to get excited about, and there wouldn't be, there potentially might not be enough money if no new money was being created. If they just said, all right, this is the amount, and society keeps growing, population grows, and the way that the system works, if you just only did that, things end up getting more expensive, and so if you had the same amount of money but more expensive things, then people would only be able to afford less things, so there's no need for that. So again, as society progresses, we need new money. Okay, if we only did element 1 and 3, there would only be temporary improvements, and we've got historical case studies of this in Australia from 1911 to 1924, the Commonwealth Bank, Canada, the Bank of Canada, and Will Abrams is going to be talking about that. And in New Zealand, I talked about that last year, and all of these places now are back to Australia and New Zealand, it's 98% of the money supply is created by a commercial banking system. And in Canada, I think it's either 97 or 98%, but Will give us an update on that later on. And we don't even know, I'm not exactly sure when that stopped happening in New Zealand, so I've got a question mark there, because they weren't really doing it much, that it was noticeable for people. The people in New Zealand didn't even know that they had it, and they didn't even know that they'd lost it, And that's why we need to make it very clear to people what this is going to do for them, and it needs to be built in up front, not sort of think that people are going to get it, because in New Zealand there was very, very good literacy of monetary matters, for generations, but still people didn't really realise that it was still going on, and they didn't realise when it had stopped. It was just sort of put into an amendment of the Reserve Bank Act. So, and who reads that? Well, apart from Bob Petit, he reads that sort of stuff. I've tried to, but All right, so in each country, eventually the policies get changed, so it's like you're back to square one again, and Will Abram's going to be talking about the Canadian experience, and it's going to be that's just going to drive home the point that you need to do all three things together. And if you only did 2 and 3, then if you kept the Fed as some sort of private entity it would just be a misfit, you know. It would be like a duck out of water, and it could potentially obstruct, you know, like in the Great Depression, they sort of sat on their hands and did nothing. And same with the Australian Commonwealth Bank in the 1930s. You know, it had been used for good stuff in Australia earlier in the 1910s and 1920s, and then it was taken over by, you know, the orthodox interests. And they did nothing for the Australian people, who suffered probably second only to the American people during the Great Depression. And, you know, they basically brought out this thing called the Premier's Plan in Australia in the 1930s to deal with the Depression, and it was the usual orthodox view of the time, which was, in the British Empire, was called Niemeyerism, after a former Bank of England and Majesty's Treasury official called Sir Otto Niemeyer, who basically went around Australia and New Zealand telling everyone that they had to tighten their belts and produce more. And the money would just appear, you know, like magic. You know, Say's law, they were still believing in Say's law at that time, which basically says that if you produce the goods, then the money will just miraculously appear, you know. But it didn't. People worked really hard, you know. They put men to pull ploughs because they were cheaper to feed than horses. You know, that was called work relief. It's a bit of an oxymoronic title, isn't it? But so they worked really hard, and the money didn't appear, and they had to plough their crops back into the ground because, you know, they couldn't get enough money to make it worthwhile to even think about harvesting it and transporting it to market. And that's why the farming parity provisions are important in the American Monetary Act as well. Okay, so again, you know, this is why, and we know it from history, you know, and when you look at the history, you work out that it's a bit of a no-brainer, really, to use Australian, New Zealand vernacular. I don't know if that just means it's pretty simple. All right, so what will each element do? So placing the Federal Reserve within the US Treasury can only make it more accountable, you know. They can't say, oh, we don't want to say where these billions or trillions of dollars have gone. You know, there'll be no difficulty getting information out of them when it's part of, you know, when it's a national body. And, you know, it'll come under the Official Information Act and all that stuff. There'll be no public-private conflict of interest. You know, the Fed, you know, one of the reasons why they're saying they don't want to disclose where this money's gone is because it could, you know, affect the commercial viability of one of their member banks, and they're owned by their member banks, so they don't want to do that, you know. And it's understandable under the present system. And the Fed, it'll become a purely functionary body, you know. This is the real crux of it down the bottom there, that the Fed will lose what it's effectively a veto power over our public policy. You know, the Congress, if they were good and people were active and participating in the political process, and we could say we demand this, and the Congress say yes, we'll do it, and then, you know, the system could say no, we're not going to do it. I mean, at the moment they're happy to keep saying to the Treasury, oh yes, keep issuing more debt instruments to us, you know. We'll take all of that, thank you very much, and just rake off every year a revenue stream. But they could say no, you know, like they did in the Depression. So element 2, having the nation providing itself with its own money, which you would think would be a prerequisite for having a modern civilized society, will restore national sovereignty, and it will enable the means to realise individual sovereignty as well. That means that you can live the life that you want without necessarily, or at least without too much financial stress and strain that the present system causes. It puts people under enormous stresses which are really mostly unnecessary. It causes breakups in families, mum and dad arguing at night. Oh, what's happening? We can't pay the mortgage this month, and we're going into overdraft again, and look at that penalty fee, and pots and pans flying around. It's not much fun. That's not, why do we need that? We don't need that. And so there'll be no monetary reason for poverty. 31% of people in America have experienced poverty in the last 4 years, 1 in 3. And it's really noticeable here. When you come from other countries, from UK or New Zealand, Australia, one of the things that hits you is that all these people shaking the cans on every street corner. And when I first came to America in 2005, I was like, I was reaching into my pocket and giving everyone change. I wanted to make a phone call. I wanted to go to a public phone box and make a phone call, but by the time I'd walked a few blocks, I'd got rid of all my change, so I had to go into a shop to buy something to get some more change, And then I just couldn't understand how all these people were just walking by and ignoring these people, but then I realised after a few days that you sort of had to do that, otherwise you just end up giving all your money away. So there's no need for that, And even with the initial dividend, that will just disappear. There won't be those people on those street corners driving everyone crazy. Well, it drives me crazy anyway. And it's just so unnecessary, and it's tragic, and it's a waste of life, It's a waste of the people's lives that are doing that, and it's, I think it takes a toll on our psyche as well. I think it erodes our humanity. It sort of makes us turn away and just become hard and cold, and that's not what people are. Well, it's not anybody that I know anyway, luckily. So there'll be no ridiculous boom and bust cycles, like this roller coaster ride we're always going on, because everything in the current system, it feedbacks on each other, and that's what economists call pro-cyclical, but it's basically everything in the way that the system's set up is everything like a little, it's not just the tail wagging the dog, it's like a flea on the dog's tail making the tail move, which then makes the dog run around chasing its tail. It's, it's crazy how it amplifies, and yeah. Okay, so then the system will work the way that people assume, This is basically one of the crux of the whole thing, is that before I read that article in 1998, I just assumed, and I'd done economics at high school for 1 year, and I thought what I was being taught was ridiculous, and I was doing physics and maths and that, and the stuff that sort of made some sort of logical sense, And you could, with physics, you could measure it, our physics teacher would take us out into the field and set up things, and we could make a hypothesis, what we thought was going to happen, then we could do an experiment, see whether it happened or not. If it happened, okay, the hypothesis was okay. If it didn't happen, why didn't it happen? We have to come up with a different idea or theory about it, which is what Stephen has taught. It's a scientific method, and I think it's it's a good foundation for the way that we go about things, and we have benefited greatly from that. We've benefited from having electricity, and all of this stuff that we've got now has come through scientific discovery and then applying that with technology, and it has enhanced our lives in the real world, but it hasn't really been reflected in the financial aspect of it. And so the system, I just thought that, even what the teacher at high school was sort of, they brush over it very quickly, but basically you've got this reserve bank, central bank that, issues money, and then you've got the commercial banks, or they call them trading banks in New Zealand, Australia, and they take the money in, and we were taught even at primary school, which is like elementary school, that we were, the local regional trustee savings bank went around to all the schools and have like a little pass book, and every week you put 20 cents in, and someone from the bank would come around and collect your 20 cents and put it in your little thing, and then they'd show you, the next time, that's how much your balance has increased, And then I asked my teacher, I said, well, if the banks are paying me this interest, how do they make any money? And she said, oh, well, they just charge the people that borrow that money a little bit more interest, and they keep the difference. And I thought, oh yeah, and I was only like 6 or 7 years old, and that makes sense, and that's the way that most people assume that the system works now. And most people assume that the government issues the money. I just assumed that they did it on using some sort of economic information and data, and they figured out how much money the economy needed, and then they distribute that issue. It is issued out some way of spending it or lending it to the banks or whatever, however way. I didn't really think of it in detail, but I just didn't think that the banks themselves would lend something that they didn't have. It's like, who else can do that? Nobody. You can't. So basically, it's a perfect fit with the way that everybody thinks it happens now. So it's not like it doesn't require any sort of paradigm shift or anything like that. What requires paradigm shift is trying to work out how the present system works. That's the hard part. The reform system will be basically the way that everybody assumes that it works because it makes sense. It just makes sense that way. So achieving national and individual sovereignty is totally impossible under the present system, because we don't have it now, and we have the present system now. So, you can say that pretty safely. Okay, so element 3, we're making the money available for public purposes. That's the most democratic way of doing it, introducing new money, and it benefits everybody. We all use roads, we all use lots of stuff in America is privatised, but in other countries, basically a lot of what we call public infrastructure or public services are provided by public entities, and we all need that stuff. We all use the roads, we all use electricity, we all use water, so it's not picking winners and losers if you do it that way, So, we all use it. These add to our national wealth and our well-being, it becomes an asset of society. And the initial citizens' dividend it'll end the recession, and Stephen, we've worked out, the figures vary between 2 trillion and 4 trillion of how much has been given to bail out the banks or whatever, and if you took an average of like 3 trillion and you divided that, if it had been, given to the people, which of course then it would end up in the bank anyway, then that would be like $10,000 per person in the US, If every man, woman and child had $10,000 more, there wouldn't be any recession right now, would there? So it's a distributive system, and it's not redistributive. I mean, there may be other things that are redistributive in it, but a redistributive is like an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. If you can have a system that's distributive to start with, then you don't really have to do so much of the redistribution, And so it's a better way of doing it. So what that would do, if it became a permanent feature, it would open the door to a whole new way of life. People would have more choice, and we all like to have choice. I don't like to be told what to do, and I know that libertarians don't like being told what to do, and I understand that because I don't like being told what to do either. I never have, and usually if I'm told to do something, I do the exact opposite just to spite them. And we all do that when we, at work. When I first started working in engineering consultancy, and we used to have it was about 100 people, and they were involved in all sorts of hydro projects and all sorts of engineering, and there was about 100 people doing engineering, and they had every Friday afternoon they'd have 2 retired ladies that would come in and do the accounts when just before I started working there. And then a few years after I started working there, they hired their first accountant, and then the accountant was managing the clerk, and then there's assistant clerks, and then eventually, by the time I left that company, the accounting department was the biggest department in the company. You know, and that happened in the space of 10 years. That's just, it's just stupid. You know, the accounting department isn't adding anything to the services of what the company was providing. You know, it's just adding to the cost of everything. And that's how this present system, it just adds to the cost of everything all the time. You know, it's so inefficient. And as engineers, we like efficiency. You know, we always want to get the maximum or the optimum out of a system. And the way this system works is just ridiculously inefficient. And it'll keep getting more inefficient because it's a structural tendency to become more and more inefficient. Everybody gets their rake off, you know, and it just drags. It just drags on the whole economy and the whole society. So we can get rid of all of that, or a lot of it anyway, you know, and it starts with the way that the money is created, the origination of it. Okay, so here's how we do it, and it's quite simple. We make the money in your bank account actually your money, like cash in your pocket. You know, you think that it's like cash in your pocket, and maybe people think that the bank has got a big vault somewhere with, you know, big stacks of $100 bills or something, but they don't. And so the money in your checking account will be yours, and only you can decide what to do with it. Your bank will look after it for you, like we think that happens now. And it does happen now, but it's not quite the way, you know, it's not really, they treat it as a liability that they promise to pay you and you promise to pay them to start with, and it's like an exchange of promises to pay it at the bank. You can't really take your bank account out of the banking system. It has to go from one bank to another bank, you know. You can never leave that system. So they have to pay between themselves, but they never have to, in aggregate, pay you. So any money that you transfer to a savings or investment account will be your loan to the bank for it to loan or invest on your behalf. And Ben Dyson's going to be going into this in detail, so I'm not going to dwell on this much, but basically, you know, I agree with what Ollie Makaprang said, that money is not capital. I think that machinery and buildings and infrastructure, that's capital. You know, money is money. And when you mix the two things up, financial and real, then you start getting into real trouble. And but anyway, this classical economic theory or whatever reckons that people deserve something because they've saved and they've invested. So basically, we'll have what's sort of called capitalism, which we don't really have at the moment. We have bankerism, but you know, if we wanted to have that sort of system, this reform will actually make it work like that, you know. And so these rules stop banks creating money as debt. Okay, so what's changed? The sovereign nation creates its own money through its government, not through banks. All money is created as money, not IOU money. And no debt is created when money is created. Banks handle your money but don't create any. Banks only lend money that they have already received for that purpose. So really it's like Alistair McConaughey was here last year and he talked about how the present system is like, you know, the saying that putting the cart before the horse. Well, because what banks do is they lend money that they anticipate or expect to receive in the future from the borrower, obviously, but also they expect through the clearing system to receive it overnight. And if they don't receive it overnight, well, they have to go and borrow from the lender of last resort. But usually it all balances out, so they can do that. But instead of that, we'll just basically change the timing sequence a bit so that banks lend money that they have received rather than lending money that they anticipate receiving. So basically it puts the horse back in front of the cart, which is, you know, the right way around, you know, for it to go forward without wobbling all over the place like the present money system and the financial system does. So so the nation stops going into debt to have what it's already got. You know, we've already got all of this real wealth, and we know that we've got the ability to produce more. So all we have to do is just handle the financial side of it so that it all works out and balances, and you know, we can do that, and that's just like measurement science, science of money, whatever you want to call it, and it's been worked out how to do that. So, so now here's a bit of perspective of systems. You know, we've got we all live in an environment. You know, we all have to breathe air, and we need water and food to live and all that, and then we live in a society, and there's culture and politics and law and all that, and then the economy is a subset of that, and then commerce is a subset of that, and then banking's really at the core of that. But the way that the present financial dimension is, it's all back to front. You know, the people talk about the economy as the epitome or the ultimate thing, and they forget, and then they treat it as though people are like a cogs in the machine, you know, that society is like a subset of the economy. And then they even they disregard the environment, you know, that's called an externality, you know, and that film that Bob Petit mentioned about the corporation, and they quote, they interviewed Milton Friedman before he passed away, and he admitted that it's a problem. So at the moment, things are around the wrong way, and see, banking is really just a little piece of it. But at the moment, the banking system dictates what happens in all the rest of those bigger systems. You see, it's the wrong way around. It's got to be put back in its place. All right, it's like all those Russian dolls, where the little doll is inside the bigger one, and you keep, you know, the bigger doll should be the one that is the thing that is important, not the little tiny thing inside. And so the structure, basically the blue arrows is policy, and the policy comes from the people, the voters, the constituents, the people that our politicians work for, okay? That's democracy. And then the Congress, they formulate laws and policies based on that, and laws based on the policies, and so with the ones that deal with the monetary system, they'll pass to a monetary authority, which will do the working out based on statutory requirements and objectives, which has been worked out through public policy processes, and then that feeds through to the Treasury. So you see, like, the monetary authority is like the meat in the sandwich, and it's like a safety valve, you know, so that you don't have someone going crazy in the Treasury and issuing trillions or whatever. You know, it's done within a controlled, measured. It's done in a controlled, measured way. You know, it's not difficult to do. And then the money comes out from the Treasury to the people, and then they are empowered because they have money in their pocket. They're empowered to have economic and political democracy much more than. I think it was J.K. Galbraith that said that nothing removes a person's liberty quicker than taking their money away from them. You know, if you don't have any money, you don't really have any liberty. You know, you can't really choose. You're dependent on other people, and it's not a good situation to be in. So there's just briefly a philosophy of democracy, I've called it, but it sounds a bit grandiose. But anyway, you have to distinguish between policy and administration, and the policy is the objective, and the administration is the organisation. Like, the policy is what are you going to do, and then the administration is how are you going to do it. You know, so you can separate that out. This is the second lobotomy. You know, you've got to go dunk, separate it out in your brain, and so the measure of how good a system is whether or not it achieves the desired results. You know, it's like if an engine's running on only 3 cylinders, you know you've got to do something about it, you know. So basically, you know, you want the policy to be all as democratic as possible, and then administration tends to be hierarchical, but you don't want policy to be captured by administration, because then you get bad situations like, Hitler and Stalin and all that sort of stuff. So it's vital that policy doesn't get captured by administration. Okay, so we got consumer purchasing power deficiency. Now, Bob Petit talked about this at the very first talk of last year's conference, and so I'm not going to go into that. That's a whole other subject. And if you want to find out about that, I suggest that you buy the video, which will be coming out some stage within the next 10 months, I hope. And it's certainly one not to be missed. So Bob Petit's talk was militarism, Keynes' solution for the Great Depression, and he went through, lots of the reasons of this. And so it steals from you. What does that work out at per person of working, that's old enough to be financially independent? Well, it takes $17,000 from you, and it takes 17 weeks of your life because that's that figure before. If you divide that by everybody that's 14 years or older, like legally allowed to work, there's 57,000. If you divide their income, it's 40,000, so it's $17,000 difference there. And so we've got purchasing power deficiency. So how's that filled up? It's filled up with consumer debt. And then we've got mortgage debt, people using their houses as an ATM, they were told to live richly. And so they're using their house as an ATM, but that's crazy. So then you've got all this total household debt, corporate debt, everybody's in debt, non-financial business total. Financial sector, even the financial sector is in debt to overseas. Federal government's in debt, state and local government's in debt, all of the government's in debt. And there's the debt money situation. The red line is money, and the red line is debt, and the blue line is money, and then cash is just down below. And so it works out as a pretty close to an exponential function. And so you got the total debt there, and it's gone through the roof since the 1980s, and that's since the time when we had this, these economic policies that were supposed to shrink government to the size of a puppy dog and drown it in a tub. But look what's happened. Because of this function, the government has to keep getting bigger and bigger, and it's outgrown the house. They reckon that it's going to be 100%, the federal debt's going to be 100% of GDP in the near future, and it's going to stay there. So it's not like shrinking to a puppy dog, these policies. That's one of the features of propaganda, is that they always do the opposite of what they say they're going to do. And instead of shrinking to a puppy dog, it's sort of outgrown the house, and it's like Clifford the Big Red Dog, that cartoon dog that has to live outside because it's so big. So we've got this current account deficit, which has been mentioned, outsourcing, and got revenue is less than expenditure, so we get deficits, and that's the annual increase in the federal government debt, and that's for 2008. Now the estimated one is for next year, for this year, is 1.8 trillion. So it's like it's almost up to the ceiling there. And then it's going to stay at about 1.3 trillion, they estimate, and then 0.9 trillion. So it's going to be way off this chart for the next foreseeable future. And then this is what it does. It just draws off all this unnecessary interest, which is, when you work it out as what your taxes are, it's about 40% for individuals. Individual income tax is about 45% of total revenue, and so if you worked it out just for individual taxpayers, it's about 40% of what they are paying is just on interest on the federal debt, which is unnecessary. So there you've got, it's just taking money away from your left, right, and centre, and this is what it does to your life. Back in the old days, in the 1400s or whatever, people had only worked 13 weeks a year to support themselves, and now look at there below the zero line. If you want a curved line that does that. So it's your life, so why waste your time? And so we need structural change. So here we go, the three elements again. Structural change, not cosmetic. Cosmetic just doesn't do it. So here's how we do it. By law, we just do the same stuff. We stop banks creating money as debt. So let's get real. Like Bob Petit mentioned, we've got an absurd disconnect between the real world and the financial system. Charles Walters, who was a great economist here, he said, he gave a talk here a couple of years ago that starts with the sun, photosynthesis. That's free. And we don't borrow things that, our cultural inheritance, we don't borrow carpentry and all of that. We've got the know-how to do stuff. We've got the raw materials, we've got big tools. We've got machines that can make stuff. We've got automated manufacturing. That's the BMW factory in Leipzig, which I've been to. It's all made by a robot. 98% of it is automated. This is all done, this construction here was done automatically by remote control and GPS. And they built this dam. And we've got automated trains. I've been on that one. It's in Toulouse. And that's a car that drives itself.
This is a great talk,
Okay.
but now you're into the second talk.
All right.
Now let's ask for questions and then a panel.
Okay.
Bob, will you come up, or do you have to operate? You have to stay there, or do you want to come up? Okay. First of all, that was a fantastic talk. And will you take questions?
Oh, yeah.
And we'll have Bob and Steve and I up here. So here, go ahead.
All right. Gentleman standing up at the back there.
I'm not the only one here somewhat confused by a lot of cannot hear you. Sir? Cannot hear you. So you can shout from there, that's clear. I said I hope I'm not the only one here confused by the rhetoric and messages that I'm getting from not just Jamie, but a lot of written material I've seen and a lot of other speakers, which I feel overstate, perhaps, is the best way of putting it, the benefits of monetary reform. For instance...
Sorry, what's the question?
Well, I have to preface it somewhat, but what about monetary reform is going to solve? You keep making the statement that it's going to solve the debt problem, but there's a lot of debt problem that goes beyond what can be accomplished through monetary reform. For instance, setting up, keeping loans.
I'm sorry, we really do want to keep these to questions. We will have a period, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have a period on Sunday where people can have a session to make whatever statements they want. That should be done at the end of the conference after you've heard everything. So right now, if you have questions, please, yeah.
Okay, the gentleman sitting down in the sort of greyish shirt. Yeah.
I was wondering, can you tell me if a correct statement that wealth is never destroyed, it's only transferred? I was wondering if you could tell whether or not your statement is accurate.
Okay, well, I think if I heard it correct, that wealth isn't destroyed. Well, I mean, things do deteriorate. You know, you have appreciation of wealth, and you also have depreciation of wealth, and you have to be able to account for that. But as we've progressed, I think we'd all agree that we are living in a better, you know, we're not living in mud huts anymore. You know, we're living in buildings that have got electricity and hot and cold water and all of that stuff. So over time, we generally appreciate in wealth, but the way that the monetary system works, we're generating more debt to it's debt that's balancing that. You know, it's all borrowing into the future. Basically, it goes like this. You know, economically, we're living off the products of the past, and financially, we're living off drafts against the future. You know, and as that disparity gets wider and wider, I mean, in Japan, they have 100-year mortgages now, so they have intergenerational mortgages, which is just ridiculous, because, you know, after 100 years, the house might need to be demolished. Okay. Okay, do you have a refined question, Mr. General? Yeah.
Monetary reform will solve the debt and interest problem and the creation of money, but as long as we have a private banking system, I feel that there is still a problem of debt and interest, which monetary reform will not handle.
Okay.
If you don't nationalize credit somehow, you're still going to have interest and you're still going to have debt.
Yeah, I think Paul Grignon in his one of his DVDs, he shows that, you know, theoretically it's possible for the way that loan schedules are structured, that if you front load a repayment schedule with the interest, and then and you have, well, basically, I mean, everybody's had a mortgage, and basically you end up paying a whole lot of interest at the beginning, and on your final payment you're just paying pure principal, and so that money can be recirculated back in the meantime. Banks, through their revenue, their profits, they distribute those to shareholders and all of that, and it does enter back into the system. It doesn't disappear. But I think, I don't want to pass the buck, excuse the pun, but I think Ben Dyson is going to be dealing with that detail a little bit more in his presentation. So rather than sort of dwelling on it now, hopefully after that, if you still have the question, certainly raise it at another time. Bob Wagas.
Your second step to monetary reform was to return sovereignty to the people.
Yeah.
So we can have democracy in action. My question is, I've never observed democracy in action in the Treasury Department, but I have observed it in Congress. Why isn't the Monetary Act returning sovereignty to Congress?
Well, the Congress will determine the policy objectives of the monetary authority, and then the monetary authority will deal with those, and then they will instruct the Treasury what to do, how much money they can create. So the sovereignty is in Congress.
The Treasury Department is part of the executive branch. That's all.
And you remember, this is a monetary authority. It's within the Treasury, but it reports to Congress, a special provision, which constitutional attorneys can examine for years and decades in advance to determine the effect of. But they report to the Congress, the monetary authority. And all of the things that get done are done only by congressional approval.
So
Has to be passed by Congress.
So you're putting the Treasury Department under Congress and not under the President?
No, we're not putting the Treasury Department under Congress. Now, as I said, constitutional attorneys can figure this out for decades to come. The monetary authority is administratively within Treasury, which is executive. They're still going to report to the Congress.
Yeah, it's the distinction between policy instructions and administrative instructions. Gentleman in the front.
Yeah, I've got a question about the difference between the $10 trillion of money supply and the $50 trillion of debt.
Yeah.
I'm confused why, if there's $10 trillion of money supply, which is essentially bank credit debt, why isn't there $50 trillion worth of, quote, money if there is $50 trillion worth of debt?
Well, you can incur, just like $1, passed between various people can incur different debts. You could have $1, like if I passed it, lent it to Bob, and he lent it to Stephen, and he lent it to Stephen, there would be $4 worth of debt added up, but there's only $1 that's been passed from one to the other, and just as a, it's like a chain. So it's various debts, but maybe Bob Petit could answer that.
As each loan is paid back, the money is taken out of circulation. It goes back into reserves and doesn't come out again until the bank lends it. But there is a residual of interest that keeps growing. So the debt keeps going up and up and up. So does the money supply, but the debt always outgrows the money. And this is clear.
I understand that. What I
Yeah.
don't understand is how the debt can be 50 trillion and the money supply can be.
Well, I just
10
gave you
trillion.
the explanation. The debt accumulates faster than the money is lent. Because each loan is extinguished when it's paid back. It goes back into the bank as excess reserves, doesn't come out again. But there's a residual of that interest that just keeps, it's like compound interest. It keeps going.
The gentleman in the round table, Gabriel.
More
don't like the term utopia, and one of the philosophers that I like to read, he didn't like the term utopia either, because he said that Adolf Hitler was a utopian, and Joseph Stalin was a utopian, and at the time Montague Norman was a utopian because they had a particular preconceived worldview, which I don't have any particular preconceived worldview. I just want to establish the means to reach whatever ends that people want. I don't tend to predetermine what everybody else wants. I just know what I want. And it's materialistic, but we're living in a materialistic world now. And I think that when the material burdens are taken off people, they'll be freed up to express themselves more creatively. They'll be able to, if they don't want to, if they don't have to sit in traffic to work 40, 50, 60, 70 hours a week, they might be able to